Hello everyone, I'm François de Jouvenel, Director of Futuribles International. Welcome to this roundtable on relations between India and Africa. This roundtable is part of the Forum on Africa's Future, and it will be moderated by Thierry Homel, head of this forum. I'd like to thank the panelists who have agreed to take part in this discussion, despite complicated schedules, and I will let Thierry introduce them later.
So good evening to all of you, and that we're pleased to be with you for this panel called India-Africa Looking to the Future. We are having such a discussion because the situation of India and France are in Africa drastically different. While France is or has been experiencing a downturn in the last 20 years, particularly in its former colonies, other countries like India are experiencing positive evolutions. India and Africa are sharing an history dating back millennia, and today Africa is one of Africa's biggest trading partners, second only to China, I think. The country extends line of credit worth billions to African nations. Its pharmaceutical company or producer dominate many African markets. Almost 1/5 of India's oil imports are coming from Africa, and almost one quarter, I think, of its natural gas are coming from the continent as well. However, relations between India and the continent are far being limited to economic cooperation, and further development are expected in the near future. To discuss this, so we are honored to host you. Sanusha Naidu is a senior researcher, senior research fellow at Institute for Global Dialogue in Western Cape, South Africa. Dr. Renu is professor and former director of the Center for African Study in University of Mumbai. And Dr. Abhishek Mishra is an associate fellow at the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses. And I am Thierry Homel, so head of Africa program at Futuribles. I'll just be your moderator for 70 minutes. And above all, I will be your timekeeper. We will have 70 minutes discussion and then maybe 20 minutes of question. I will avoid to waste time. So you will have the floor now, and we will start with the beginning. As I said, so relation between India and Africa as a whole. My question will be maybe for Sanusha. Could you enlighten us about Indian community in Africa?
Thank you very much, Thierry, and thank you very much for the invitation. Good day to all of you, good day to my fellow panelists, and good day to all those that are online listening to this very, very timely, very important discussion around the India-Africa, or if you want to kind of juxtapose it, the Africa-India relationship. I think what's really important, Thierry, and to the colleagues online, is to understand to what extent the relationship between India and Africa actually extend beyond the kind of Cold War or pre-Cold War period to kind of understand the civilizational linkages between the two sides. And I think, you know, Dr. Modi has done a lot of research around the kind of relationship that Africa has or India has with Africa based that extends beyond just the kind of dynamic of the Cold War or the kind of anti-colonial and anti-racist forum, and more importantly, along the non-aligned movement questions around Bandung. I think looking at culture, looking at civilization, looking at trade, looking at commerce, this extends to communities that exist even in terms of what the Chinese have now refashioned or rebranded as the Belt and Road Initiative. India and Africa have an extensive kind of Silk Road engagement that extends to culture, extends to interactions with different communities on the east coast of Africa, the discovery of archaeological finds, and more importantly, I think even the point in which at one time there was an African kingdom in India. And today we see this linkages not getting the kind of ventilation it should get, but basically going back to the question of looking at it in a historical time frame or a historical period. And I think the challenge is really understanding that these are continents or that have been connected over the past historical milieu in terms of how they have related to each other. And so when you look at the African community or the African diaspora, or you look at the kind of Indian diaspora in Africa, the kind of connection between communities, I think you have to go beyond just the kind of question of the new diaspora that has come in perhaps in the late 1990s or early 1990s, the linkages that you have in terms of the time frame of these diasporas. So in the case of Southern Africa, me being of Indian origin as well, it's the oldest diaspora in terms of indentured labor under the whole kind of relationship that existed between the British colony of India and, of course, the British colonies of South Africa, which were Natal and Cape Colony. And in that way, it was about a labor relationship. And it was very much embedded and anchored along the commercial interests of bringing in labor that was then used as the basis to try and enable and allow for the commercial expansion of the British colonial commercial engagements in the cane fields, in the sugar industry. And that led to a community that exists here today that is over 150 years old, coming from parts of India, as from the north to the south, and of course settling here over a period of time. Their relationship to India is both one of a historical ancestral root, but it's also one that actually looks at India in terms of identity. You know, are we South African first and then Indian, or are we Indian first and then South African? And I think part of the challenge you have here in South Africa around the diaspora is the connectivity historically. Yes, we do take the cultural dynamics very interestingly that is embedded and integrated in the communities in the way that our cultural dynamics have evolved. But we also have a history that is related to the role that India played in the anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, with the kinds of lessons that we extrapolate from the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. Many people argue that it was here in South Africa that Mahatma Gandhi had learned how a kind of anti-colonial stance and the kind of issues he took back to India that basically taught him about trying to find the dynamics around the resistance to colonialism. I think going forward now, we have to look at what are the newer dynamics around the Indian diaspora in Africa, whether we look at it in the same way that we did in the historical context of the relationship we have in terms of identity. Do we connect in terms of the diaspora globally in Southern Africa? And also our relationship to the diaspora, not just in Southern Africa, but also in the East African region. And I think the geography of India plays a critical role to this diaspora. Much in Southern Africa is South Indian. In East Africa, it's much more North Indian. And I think these are key critical points in terms of how those identities play out from historically where we are from and where we're going to. And then more importantly, I think we need to link to the global diaspora of the Indian context. You know, one of the things that I've really enjoyed watching not so long ago was when Prime Minister Modi went to Australia not so long ago, and he actually was in Sydney. And the Australian Prime Minister at the time said that at the Sydney Auditorium, he was there when Bruce Springsteen was actually doing a concert. But his comments, and I paraphrase, was that I now know who the real boss is. And he was referring to Modi. The kind of charm, the kind of attraction, the kind of pull, and the kind of charisma that Modi has for the Indian diaspora globally. But I think we also have to be realistic about what attracts us here in South Africa and in the Southern African region to the Modi government in terms of that diasporic connection. And I think if we look at it, the connection again is economic, but it's also cultural. And I think there's a hierarchy of that tends to look at the global diaspora much more in the North American context, in the Australian context, and of course in Europe, particularly the UK. And I think the diaspora in Southern Africa features a bit lower on that kind of scale. And I think the connections here again is whether or not it's only about commerce, or is it about culture, or is it about the oldest civilization? And how do we connect those issues? Because I think in South Africa, being a third, fourth generation Indian born in diaspora, sometimes the connections are not as real as perhaps those connections are in North America, in Australia, in Europe, in particular in the UK, and more importantly, I think looking at the Caribbean as well. So I want to stop there, Terry, with those comments, because I think that the kind of economic connections we are talking about in terms of India and how important India is right now to revitalizing the African engagement in terms of the connections around commerce, trade, investment, energy, etc. It plays a critical role, but I think it also has a different interpretation in terms of whether me as a third, fourth generation Indian in the diaspora in Southern Africa, do I feel that connection to India? And I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you so much, Sanusha. So thank you for this precision, because this fact are a bit unknown here. To get a bit further and not to stop on diaspora, so I will address my second question to Renu, so I think. And so we're discussing about cooperation. So you spoke about economics, you spoke about cultural cooperation. So what are the ventures we can expect in the coming years? And so you discuss, Sanusha discussed South Africa, Eastern Africa. So what are actually the key countries for India?
So the level of cooperation between India and Africa is multi-sectoral. It's in various sectors. I would think personally that agriculture is the most critical sector for Africa, because Africa imports $100 billion USD worth of grains every year. With the COVID pandemic and the Ukraine-Russia war, the supplies have been a challenge, and the cost of imports has increased. So these import bills would rise. And the agriculture sector contributes 32% or a third to the GDP of Africa. It employs over 60% of the population, 2.2 million smallholder farmers, and 70% of the women. So the agriculture sector is most critical for poverty elevation, for meeting the SDGs, or meeting the Agenda 2063. And India and Africa have several years of cooperation in the sector because of similarity of circumstances in both the countries. And so agriculture is a major sector of cooperation, where India has been working with other international organizations like ICRISAT. In India, currently we have this Mission Millet, which is producing food grains for rain-fed areas. And Africa too has this challenge of production in rain-fed areas, because it has to feed a large populace. And then we've had some successful programs like the Cotton Technical Assistance Program. We know the C5 countries. So in cotton sector, India with the WTO launched a very successful capacity building initiative, where the quality of cotton, the post-harvest technologies, and the value addition to cotton was undertaken. There are some other projects which I'd really like to flag, and they are not spoken about. They are small in scale, but highly impactful and scalable. One of them was CETA, that was supporting Indian trade in Africa, which was a private-public partnership. Thierry, one thing that we have noticed studying Africa over the years is there has been a gradual movement from G2G cooperation to private sector investments and public-private sector initiatives. So CETA was a trilateral cooperation initiative between 5 countries in East African countries in Africa: Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, Ethiopia, Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Ethiopia. And in that, the Indian private sector supported the production of chilies, whatever were their agro-commodities being produced, and supporting them to market them in India. At the India-Africa Forum Summit, a major multilateral forum summit between India and Africa since 2008, India has provided on a non-reciprocal basis duty-free tariff preference schemes, where these countries where the CETA was implemented, and in 27 LDC countries, they could export their products without tariffs. So that was a big initiative on the part of Africa. Agriculture is one sector which I have detailed. The other sector that I would like to talk about is health and pharmaceuticals. And this is the trade balance is entirely in favor of India currently. 99% of India's exports to countries in Africa, and there is no trade in pharmaceuticals and healthcare products from Africa to India. So, and Indian companies are considered very reliable. There is generic medicine as well, wellness medicines, which supply to at least 42 countries across Africa. One of the grounds that I have heard from pharmaceutical manufacturers is that in West Africa, in Francophonie, they have limited access because of the rules that the France has for trading with Francophone African countries. So all the products have to go via France and then to the Francophone African countries, which increases the cost. So these are some of the things which need to be taken forward at the policy level. Then the other sectors of cooperation, of course, are oil and natural gas. This has been an old cooperation area. And in fact, ONGC Videsh has been operational in Tanzania since 1970s to help it with the offshore oil explorations when there was doubt whether there was oil at all. So these in the oil sector, there has been investment by the Indian companies, sharing of technologies. Minerals and metals, again, Indian FDI has gone into this sector. And these areas are of mutual benefit because India needs oilseeds from Africa in the agriculture sector. India needs a market for its pharmaceutical sector. In the manufacturing sector, again, there has been a cooperation where light machinery, agro machinery, then electrical machinery, transporters, all these are exported to Africa. So there's basic mutuality of interest where Africa gains from Indian technology transfer, capacity building, and resources. Another sector which I think is of significance would be transportation and automobiles. So if you go to, I recently went to Senegal, I could see Indian automobiles. I went to Mozambique. We have those small TVS scooters. Then you have the big army vehicles. Some of them were jeeps were exported to Mozambique and several countries across Africa. Then you have railway locomotives. So I mean, the list can go on. It's a lot of many sectors that India and Africa cooperate on. And yet another tool for this cooperation or development cooperation have been in lines of credit. So in early 2002s, there was a program by the India Exim Bank to extend its footprints to Africa. And since then, we have 60% of India's LOCs go to Africa, with over 204 or 2005 LOCs extended to Africa, amounting over 2 billion. Across sectors, water, irrigation, rural electrification, large dams, small projects, health outposts. So this has been one of the areas, major areas of cooperation in various social sectors, that is energy, electricity, agriculture, rural electrification, health, you name it, irrigation, water purification. So the list is really multi-sectoral. I think our development cooperation has been at 3 levels: on the country level, at the regional level, and through the Africa Union. 2 significant projects that I would like to flag are the Pan-Africa E-Network project, which is divided into 2 parts: the health component, the E-Arogya Bharti, and the educational component, which is the E-Vidya Bharti. On these projects, India has transferred via the internet the technologies of building capacity in the healthcare sector and education, online education in various sectors of, accountancy, pharmacy, management. So these are some of the areas. Yet another, the last sector I would like to point, of course there are many, is the infrastructure sector. So we know that Africa, for growth in Africa, there have been a requirement of at least $100 billion per year. And this cannot be met by any significant country. Of course, Sanusha mentioned the BRI. So China has invested heavily, but other countries, the Western countries, have invested as well. And India too has invested within this rubric of South-South cooperation and infrastructure for development for Africa, that is PIDA. So education and skilling, capacity building, transfer of technology, infrastructure development, and the last one, the second sector I wanted to mention, was digital transformation. India has made leaps and bounds in what we abbreviate as the JAM Trinity, which is, we have the Jan Dhan accounts for people, the unique ID system called the Aadhaar, which is a unique digital identification numbers, and mobile technology. Through this, there is direct cash transfer to the intended beneficiaries, avoiding any loopholes and corruption. So Africa, this is one area where the government of India and many countries in Africa are working together to share these digital technologies for their own e-governance. So I'll stop there, Terry, and we'll take it forward.
Thank you so much. So we discussed a lot of cooperative fields, so a lot of potential: agriculture, health and pharmaceutical, natural gas, oil, transportation, infrastructure. And as you said, you're not alone. So you're competing with a lot of competitors that are powerful. I will address my question to Abhishek. So let's discuss a bit further. So technological cooperation. What kind of technology developed in India are really of great interest to African country? And why do you think you could have a competitive advantage compared to Western countries or US or other countries like China?
Thank you, Thierry, for having me, and good day to everyone.
You're welcome.
Certainly, I'll elaborate on the technological aspect. I mean, what we have been noticing is that, like, very much a fashionable trend in recent years is the surge in digital innovations across, and also the mobile phone usage as well across both sub-Saharan Africa and India as well. However, at the same time, I mean, Africa as a continent is still yet to reach the same levels of digital maturity which other regions of the world have seen, both in terms of maybe digital penetration or usage or capabilities. This is here where the Indian experience comes in very much handy, but primarily because of the kind of challenges which both sub-Saharan African countries and India faces. We face very similar challenges in terms of low internet speed, then limited broadband usage as well. Sometimes costs were also high. But this is where India's in recent years, like Indian government, we have launched a number of unique initiatives which are aimed at digital transformation. As Dr. Modi mentioned, Dr. Renu Modi mentioned that there's a thing called Aadhaar card. I mean, of course, that provides a unique, through our biometrics and demographics, that provides a unique identification number for Indians. That actually helps in linking all of our banking details or physical address, all of our utility bills, etc. So these are the sort of innovations which India is looking to export to African countries. I mean, Aadhaar is similar to maybe a Ghana card, which is there in Ghana. But the only difference is that, like, uh, unlike the Ghana card and all, the Ghana card basically it confers, I believe, citizenship on its holders. Aadhaar card doesn't confer citizenship, but its utility is the same. So these kind of innovations, and then on top of that, again, Pan Africa Unit project, uh, which worked in 48 African countries. That was very successful initiative, especially the tele-education component of it. The telemedicine component also was successful, but not as much as the tele-education one. The second phase of this project is the EVAB project. Essentially, rather than satellite technology, what we are using is web-based portals in this second phase of the thing. Recently, just yesterday, we launched the IIT Zanzibar, IIT Madras campus also in Zanzibar, Tanzania. That's a very unique initiative, and through that, India hopes to get a lot more African students also from other parts of the continent, particularly West Africa as well. The unique advantage, comparative advantage, is that, like, which India has in terms of digital public infrastructure and all in Africa, is that, I mean, India being a large federal democracy, India's own experience with digital transformation, it essentially serves as a much more relatable model, I believe, rather than the Western counterparts. Because as the world is trying to embrace much more digital innovations, this is, of course, India's golden opportunity, I may say, to distinguish itself as a partner of Africa with a difference. The Jam Trinity, which is the Jandhan mobile technology trinity, that is another thing which we are looking to export. All these initiatives, I should add that India is looking to use all of these initiatives as a example of its, in order to project its soft power. This is not a economic this is not an economic agenda or any business opportunity which India is trying to take advantage of. This is a question of more of a soft power, and the experience which India has and the challenges it has overcome in terms of so many, like, billion population and all, and having to like get people together. So that serves as a much more relatable model which can be replicated in various African countries.
Okay, so you discussed soft power. So Renu discussed South-South cooperation. Do you think so? You have in India a better understanding of the need, so from African countries' needs, and do you think is it easier for competitors, for Indian companies to build trust in Africa?
Okay, yeah. So I believe that there are obviously there are certain comparative advantages which India enjoy. First and foremost, it's obviously proximity across the Indian Ocean. Second is language. Third is Bollywood, if you may even say. That is also very much popular amongst especially East African and Southern African countries. So it does give us an advantage in the sense that like Indian especially public sector PSUs and all, we have been in African markets for a long time. So we know African markets. Of course, currently the trade, I believe, India-Africa it has just touched 100 billion cumulative trade, which is, of course, it's not a small number, but at the same time, given the potential which India and Africa has, it's not up to the mark as well. And cumulative investments worth 75 billion as well, which is nowhere comparable with China's. But we do realize and recognize that we do not want to copy neither what is China is doing nor any other country as well. We have our own way of going about things, own comparative advantage in terms of IT, in terms of human resource, skilling, capacity building, vocational training, and those are the areas which we will in the future also continue to place emphasis upon.
I was just going to add that Africa is different today. And while we are talking from the perspective of India, I would like to add that Africa of 2023 is different from the Africa of the 1970s. And today, Africa is at the driving seat. There are many players. So whatever be any country's comparative advantage or soft power, Africa is choosing between its partners based on its own strategic interests and also playing many partners together. So it can be best friends with or can trust India when it comes to digital technology or defense cooperation, but it can also trust China or France in other sectors. So that is what I just wanted to add.
Yeah, thank you for this precision. So we will reverse a bit the game. So we will not get into the need of African countries now, but the need of India. So and India has a huge problem with energy security. It's a key driver for India's growth. What do you think can happen in the field of hydrocarbon and natural gas? And if we're looking a bit further, so in the field of energy transition, so what could happen as well with minerals? Renu?
Okay. Let me first start at the outset that with a very small statistics that India has 18% of the global population. It has the requirement of about 6 to 7% of the global energy, and it has only 0.3% of the global hydrocarbons and energy resources. Given the pace of development and that India is very self-sufficient in many of its manufacturing and industrialization needs, the requirement for energy sector is only going to increase. In this scenario, against this backdrop, I would like to say that in one word, that India is an energy deficient country and highly reliant on imports of hydrocarbons. Given the volatility and the geopolitics currently underplaying, or what currently for the last always or for several years, a strategy would be to diversify its energy basket, and that's what India has done. Actually, about 58% of our energy requirements, that is hydrocarbons and crude oil, come from the Middle East still, Iraq, UAE, Saudi Arabia. So they continue to remain our major partners. And India has very good strategic relations with all these Middle East countries. But in its endeavor to diversify its resources, India has been importing energy, hydrocarbons, natural gas from Africa, and about 16 to 18% of India's energy requirements are from Africa. The major countries are Nigeria, Angola, Algeria primarily. And with the Team 9 initiative, which was launched in 2004, India realized that its footprints in West Africa were very limited. And when oil and natural gas was found in the Gulf of Guinea, Equatorial Guinea became a major area of interest for Africa, especially for energy security. So that is when, post 2004, India has increased its footprints in Francophone Africa. So I recently traveled to Ivory Coast, to Senegal, Ghana, and we find that there are a lot, many, even though the diaspora is very minimally present in these countries, Indian companies and NRIs are operating in these countries. And earlier, I'd just like to add that India had only 27 diplomatic missions in African countries, but in the last 3 years, we've added 18 new diplomatic missions. So the Indian presence to meet its trade, investment, and energy security requirements currently are in 47 countries. So that's where I'm saying India is importing not only from Middle East, but also from Africa. And Africa is a major supplier. One advantage that India has is the proximity, as Abhishek just mentioned. The East countries from the East coast of Africa, for example, Tanzania, Mozambique, are much closer to for imports to India than Venezuela or Russia and other countries from which it exports. So that is one aspect of energy requirement. Then in Tanzania, we have had recent in October, we had a visit from the president of Tanzania to India, and our relationship has been increased to a strategic level. One key factor to this is also that the discovery of, the supplies of potential supplies of hydrocarbons and natural gas that Tanzania offers. India also invested heavily with other international partners in Mozambique, in the Cabo Delgado region, but because of insurgency, a force majeure has been declared there. India also invested in Sudan earlier, but with the conflict, and so in Sudan, there has been a cessation of supplies from these countries. So in Africa, India looks for countries where its interest can be strategic, and these countries, conflict and peace, conflict is not conducive to any trade, including the supplies of hydrocarbons. So unfortunately, these investments are locked for India, but India is a corollary to this interest in hydrocarbons is the access of safe sea lanes from the littorals of East Africa to India. And it is in this context, India has increased its maritime security and cooperation with the littoral states, such as Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, which have a long shoreline, and the island states of Seychelles, Madagascar, Mauritius, and increase its early warning capacities, etc. And also working on harnessing the blue economy between these India and Africa. So this is one aspect of energy security. With regard to energy transition, India is very well aware and a part of the International Solar Alliance, along with France and many countries in Africa, where they have been talking of one sun, one world, one grid. And given that several African countries have abundant sunshine around the year, that is the countries between the Tropic of Cancer and Capricorn, India has been a major supplier of solar technologies to these countries. And another factor that Indian companies are factoring in while exploration of coal and oil, at least I don't know on the ground how much of it is being implemented, but I do hear these words now recently in various conclaves in academic conferences, which I did not hear over the last, at least about 7-8 years ago. These are concepts of sustainable development, responsible investment, community engagements, landfilling, and restoration of areas where these explorations are taking place. So the key to energy sector and coal exploration between India and Africa will be where Indian companies earn a goodwill through investing in local communities and following the ESGs, that is environmental social governance rules, and complying with the environmental sustainability norms in these countries. Because African countries, as I say, have been, to talk from their point of view, the Africa of 2023 is not the same as the Africa of the 70s or 80s. So you hear of cases where African counties, for example, in Kenya, have taken a major Indian company to court because of the environmental pollution that the company allegedly has engaged in. And so there's a litigation going on. And we know of various countries in China which have been expelled with their exploration activities because of the level of pollution that they engage in. So I'm just trying to be adding this caveat that while doing energy security, Indian companies are much more responsible, or will have to be greatly responsible in the years to come. And also because all these countries, if India itself talks about and takes leadership of the International Solar Alliance as a major player, then it has to walk the talk. So that is one aspect. And India is also committed to reducing carbon emissions. So therefore, we have also been importing strategic minerals from Africa, and we have been going more electrical vehicles. So there's not so much confidence in electrical vehicles. Frankly speaking, when I had to buy a car, I was wondering whether I should buy an EV. I find the young generation very savvy. They seem to be more familiar with the technology. So if you see a young techie of 30s or 20s, he buys an electrical vehicle, he takes it to charge it to some distance point, but I think it will take time. So we are very conscious of the energy transition. And with regard to the transition in climate finance, India has been advocating the common position with Africa with regard to the CBDR and the climate finance, which the West has not yet been up to the mark in transferring. So if there's anything else I could add, you can ask me a question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, let's discuss a bit. So I understand very well so the position on hydrocarbons. And let's discuss a bit so this energy transition issue, because so you said you're not very confident with electric vehicles. I don't know if I am, so but we all encourage to build and to drive such kind of vehicles, so in the near future. How can it be in India? So because you're facing actually the same problem we are facing in Europe. These minerals are coming from the copper belt, meaning DSC. The mining companies operating there are all Chinese. So you have 20 companies operating there. I think 18 of them are Chinese. One is Swiss with Chinese capitals. The other one I ignore. So it will be very difficult for Indian companies to go in this region. That is not really safe, that is not really peaceful, but that is strategic for India if you want to develop this technology. So I don't know who to address this, this crucial and difficult question. Oh, Sanusha?
Thank you very much, and thank you for the conversation, because I think it's coming to a very critical point that we need to start being much more realistic about, and that's Africa. Two things I want to go on to with that Renu and Abhishek made about where is Africa today versus where was Africa in the 70s and 80s. I would go one step further and say, where is Africa today versus Africa 10 years ago? It's a changing landscape. Mm-hmm. It is a younger and a much more youngish demographic profile. So you've got a continent that is youthful. And these are young people between the ages of 18 and 35 who are highly, highly strung because they haven't been able to engage with both domestic landscape in terms of the political leadership, in terms of the social justice struggles. And they're becoming increasingly agitated and restless. And this is a reality not just for China, not just for former traditional development partners in Africa. It's a reality for India, it's a reality for the Gulf states, it's a reality for every actor who comes to Africa and says, we can do something different than somebody else. Because if you go back and you ask yourself, what has been the experience of people in Africa with both their governments and the impact of external partnerships? There's always a challenge. Terry, you mentioned the DRC. The DRC and the critical minerals belt that you spoke about is something that has become increasingly important, but also a geopolitical issue in terms of what's going on and how do you capture that belt, or how do you capture the critical minerals value chain. And capturing the critical minerals value chain is actually part of this incredible conflict that's taking place between Beijing and Washington. Whether you talk about the Inflation Reduction Act, whether you talk about the Sanctions Act, whether you talk about other ways in which you're trying to minimize the other through competition and rivalry. Just today, we see the USA's Development Finance Corporation financing the port, a deep water port in Colombo, Sri Lanka.
Yeah, in Sri Lanka.
And that's going to be because of the amount of trade, amount of commercial activity that happens there. Now, this is not about whether this is about development for us. It is about the competition and the rivalry. And this is something we've got to be realistic about. And I think there's a point here that we need to ask ourselves. There's two things happening in the continent. Where you're sitting in the continent is very important. If you're looking from an outsider-insider perspective, you may not pick up the nuances. Cabo Delgado is not because people are just angry. The young people are angry. They're angry because they're looking at their parents and saying, where is the development? I went to Mozambique 15 years ago, 20 years ago, when development was, by the World Bank, put at 17% growth. When you walked into a country like Mozambique, that when the international indicators were saying, this is the future of the Southern African region, 17% growth wasn't palatable in the realistic architecture of Mozambique. It wasn't there. Where was the growth? The growth was what the indicators were projecting in terms of how much your carbon exports, your oil exports, your this exports is going to push a country's GDP. After COVID, we've got serious dilemmas in Africa. A younger generation who are not willing to accept that they are going to be dispossessed of their land. They're not going to accept that they're no longer going to be part of the developmental state. And we have a serious challenge in Africa where a lot of the interpretation of Africa is actually happening outside of Africa. And there's agency that's lost in Africa. So what we've got to be careful of is the assumption made that one actor can actually bring about a development agenda or do things differently. For me personally, I think countries that are coming to Africa or reconstituting or reconfiguring their relationship with Africa will have to be much more mindful of this younger, restless youth who are essentially much more prone to challenge not just their governments, who, as you see in the coups in West Africa, as you've seen in terms of the elections that we are seeing that's happening down the road in terms of East Africa, etc., and of course in the DRC, we're not sure how that's playing out. We've seen the elections that have emerged, which have never been free or fair in Zimbabwe. Is that there's a younger generation that are much more expressive of their agency, and that I think when you're talking about investment, you're talking about development, you're talking about external trade partnerships or external development cooperation partnerships. It's not about how do we offset the other, because we are in a competition. The geopolitical rivalry, the geostrategic competition is happening in Africa in a very real way. And what's very, very interesting about this is that if you look at Sudan today, and you look at the fact that the whole question of conflict has re-emerged, if you look at the tension between what's going on with Ethiopia wanting to claim the Red Sea port, and you look at the whole region of where a lot of this high level and high volume of investment is with high return, it's actually in very, very strategic conflict regions. The Horn of Africa, the east coast of Africa linking up to the Red Sea, up into where your maritime security choke points are. And that's going to be incredibly difficult to resolve. So I think the challenge for us is to not become about what's going to be our relationship. The real challenge here is how are you going to deal with political instability where there are younger generations who are not necessarily in tune with their governments because their governments have become what you would call geriatric leaders who haven't basically left office and they're still staying in office or they're holding on to office, as in Southern Africa with the liberation issues, and they have these political parties that are still there. But look at Zambia, for example. And Zambia is one of those countries where you saw the youth come out and vote for a younger, business-minded president. But that same president now is in the context of saying, I need investment because I need to deliver all of what I promised in terms of the election. So if that president is going to speak to different actors in the global arena, it's not going to be whether or not this actor is preferred over the other actor. It's what I extract out of this relationship. So agency right now for the African continent is quite critical, because I think the challenge is not so much about who does what better. The question is, how do we extrapolate the best deals? And unfortunately, what's going to be critical for us in Africa is to understand the role of the African Union in playing that role of stability, peace, and development. But more importantly, the conversation needs to be also looked at in the context of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, because that is a key pivot. That is a key pivot to the development of the African continent. And if you look at the Secretariat in Ghana, they've done a lot of work on training and capacity building. But it also has to think about whether it is only about boosting intra-African trade and value and global, regional value chains, and how does that promote the development agenda for Africa, but what is the relationship with external partners? So the rules of origin, the fact that you have duty-free, market-free access within and the kind of zero tariffing that has been ratified under the ACFTA also means that when external partners are coming into Africa, they have to take cognizance of not just how much they are, what is the bilateral relationship between one country and 55 countries, but what is the relationship between that country and the ACFTA.
Thank you very much. So very important, so what you said. Let's go a bit further. So actually, so you're right. So the model of cooperation with Africa, I mean the commercial one, has been a very extractive one. So the one used by the Westernies, the one used by China as well. So we're asking for commodities or raw material, and we're transforming in our countries. So we're making the value there, and it's not very profitable for African people. You said so. The young people are changing. Governments as well, and they are now requiring or asking for something else. So meaning, if you want to invest in Africa now, so as an Indian company or as an Indian investor, you will have to propose something else. I totally agree with that. So you will have to transform in Africa, you will have to do something else. But I will address this question to Abhishek, because so if you transform in Africa, so we spoke as well about stability, about risk, and etc. How can you protect such kind of investment? And does this investment not need or require as well the development of security partnership? Abhishek.
So, of course, any sort of investments require security partnerships, and in terms of both, in terms of like physical infrastructure, security for physical infrastructure, as well as obviously the companies and the folks, the staff which are going there and who are there engaged in the process. From an Indian perspective, essentially, like whenever we are talking of security, it has been restricted to maritime security, that is like patrolling of African waters in the Western Indian Ocean region. France, in that instance, is a very important partner for India, also for the Indian Navy in that region. And the other aspect is the under the United Nations peacekeeping forces, which in itself is going through a lot of debates, as we all know. So now it's a time to like focus much more on issues like like counter-insurgency, counter-terrorism aspects. India has come up with 2 new initiatives when it comes to security. One is we have started a India-Africa Defense Ministers Conclave, which essentially is an annual, biannual meeting and all. Essentially, it's an annual meeting where the ministers from African countries and their counterparts in India, they come together and discuss issues of mutual interest. And the other initiative is the Africa-India field training exercises, where last year around 25 or 26 African countries participated. They came to India and they basically conducted humanitarian mine operations and all, which is under, I believe, Chapter 6 of United Nations Charter. So protecting investments from an Indian perspective, obviously, it is important, not just because that is not the only reason why we need to get into security partnerships. The other reason is, as Dr. Modi had also mentioned earlier, that India has now opened up new embassies as well. So the security of those embassies and their officials, that also matters to us. In terms of maritime, on the maritime realm, unimpeded commerce has always been a major concern for seafarers, for Indian seafarers, because through the Gulf of Aden and all, around almost 50% of India's imports, and 60% of India's total overall exports passes through the Gulf of Aden, that region. So certainly it's a very important maritime choke point from an Indian perspective. And of course, addressing the elephant in the room, China's unilateralism in the region, its engagement in IUU fishing activities, its engagement in maritime surveillance, maritime militia, etc. So these are like actual like national security concerns for India, and that is one of the reasons why African countries, especially on the Western Indian Ocean region, on the East Coast and the Indian Ocean island nations, they are so important for India. We have been doing security partnerships. Security is not a new theme. Just as I mentioned, it only used to be limited to United Nations peacekeeping or the anti-piracy patrols and all over the last decade. But now it's evolving into much more broader, it's becoming much more broad-based. So it's not just now only training of officers or this, that, but new issues like maritime domain awareness, MOUs we are signing. We have defense partnership with all these East African countries and the Indian Ocean island nations. Gulf of Guinea also is coming up. Of course, our predominant interest lies on the Indian Ocean, Western Indian Ocean side of things, but Gulf of Guinea also India trades. Nigeria is a very big, out of total India's 15% oil, which India imports from African countries, 13% is from Nigeria itself. And the rest of the countries are like Equatorial Guinea, Angola, Sudan, etc. So certainly the Gulf of Guinea is also another theater, but that is not the primary theater where India is concerned. Our main concerns are on the Indian Ocean side of things. So the issue right now which we are dealing with is much more broad based. We are looking at in terms of improving interoperability between our navies, between our armed forces. We are trying to look at stopping financing also, illicit stopping financing of all these hawala terrorist channels and all as well. So these are all like new areas: maritime domain awareness, MOU on white shipping and grey shipping information. So it's much more, the security component of India-Africa relations is much more broad-based than what it was a decade or decade and a half back.
Okay, thank you so much. So you mentioned peacekeeping, embassies, protecting investment. So that is very interesting. From what I know, so India aimed to be a global actor as well, and so want to have some protection. So can we as well explain some security partnership between India and African country with this perspective? So not anymore with an African perspective, but with an Indian one in a competition with China, for instance?
When it comes to competition with China, our main concern is on our northern borders. In Indian Ocean, we deliberately, both India from our end and from the Chinese on their end, we very well know that, we have the first mover advantage when it comes to Indian Ocean. China knows that very well. So intentionally, we are not going to come head to head in a head-to-head contact in the Indian Ocean. That is my personal belief. Other commentators or people might disagree with me on that. So India does not look at it in terms of power projection. To be honest, we are looking at it in terms of, just because of the needs, we are trying to align our needs much more closely with the needs which is mentioned under Africa's like Agenda 2063, whether it's initiatives like silencing the guns or whatever initiative it is. As Sanusha also mentioned, AFCFTA also very important. Trying to understand them, trying to fine-tune our own engagement on those lines. So I wouldn't call it power projection. The power projection which we show is definitely on the Indian Ocean side of things. We are a blue water navy. We are having much more sustained presence in the Western Indian Ocean, and in that respect, France is particularly a very important partner for us there in terms of developing the maritime security architecture in that region, and other components like information sharing and all, surveillance, satellite sharing of satellite imagery and all. These are all small other training, all other components and all. So it's not about projecting power, but it's more about trying to understand African requirements.
Okay, thank you so much. We discussed Indian competitive advantage to invest in Africa compared to Western companies and etc. But conversely, so if we're looking still now, so in which area are Indian company or Indian diplomacy still lagging behind, particularly in relation to China or other competitors?
I mean, I don't think it's so much about whether there's a lag as opposed to where Indian companies are not in a context of competing with China. I think it's more a question of, what is the dynamic of the Indian footprint in the continent. One of the key challenges, or one of the key questions that I think as African analysts, African commentators and researchers working in the policy think tank environment keep coming back to is this constant kind of idea that, there's a competition between India and China. And I think they bring that comes from what Abhishek was saying, what's going on in the Indian Ocean context, what's happening in terms of the broader Asia Pacific, which, because the Americans now have included that as the Indo-Pacific, the tensions around there, the challenges in terms of whether there's an inherent tension or inherent competition in the BRICS with regard to India and China, and we saw that at the summit now with regard to expansion and how this played out. I don't think it's a question of saying, well, these are the sectors where India lags behind China. I think what is much more critical for us to understand is, where is India's Africa strategy going and who defines India's Africa strategy? Is it Indian government, or is it the Indian conclave? Is it Indian industry? Is it the private sector? Is it the companies? Because in the last couple of years, it's been very interesting to note that there's been a lot of activity from the Indian private sector side in terms of the relationship building and the kind of anchoring of the engagement around commercial interests. But now with the Indian government increasing the number of missions in Africa, tells you that there's a seriousness coming into Delhi, into the Ministry of External Affairs. Despite what the total trade or the cumulative investment may be like, I think we've got to be careful as well to compare China's total trade with Africa and India's total trade with Africa. And the one thing we've got to keep coming back to is, this is a continent, it's not a country. It is a continent of 50 plus 54 countries. So if you break down that total trade, it becomes negligible in the broader scheme of things. But the bigger challenge is, what is the relationship building, both in terms of whether this is happening in the context of how the Africa strategy is being defined, and more importantly from the African side. We cannot have a single African strategy towards China or to India or to the Gulf states or to Turkey or to the US, but it kind of enables you to understand what are the key pivot points. And Renu mentioned PIDA, the Presidential Infrastructure Development Program. And we have NEPAD, the new Partnership for Development in Africa. And these are key infrastructure issues. One of the key things India will have to deal with, and I see this from experience with other external partners, is understanding the interconnectivity between countries. So if you're going to use the railway system between Angola and move your goods in terms of the value chain across the belt to the East African region, then of course you've got to look at what investment is going to happen in that whole trajectory of the value chain in terms of moving, whether it's the oil from Angola across the Southern African belt to which port? Is it the Durban port? Right now, there's a lot of congestion in the Durban port. We have serious challenges in our infrastructure, of our port infrastructure, in our SOEs, state-owned enterprises. So is it now understanding how to build the port along the east coast of Africa? Is it in Mozambique? Is it the Maputo port? Is it the Beira port? How deep is those ports going to be? What kind of terminal you're going to have? These are critical issues in terms of the needs and how you're going to understand the infrastructure linked to the kind of development cooperation, commercial interest, as well as the relationship of moving goods back and forth to the continent. And of course, the other real problem is that across the east coast of Africa, going right up to Ethiopia, and of course you've got other actors. For example, DP World has just entered into a cooperative agreement with Tanzania under an expansion of rehabilitating or expanding or into some kind of contract in terms of building and expanding the Dar es Salaam port. So there's that competition, I think, is interesting as well. Unless, of course, you're going to see collaborative engagements between, say, trilateral relationships between India, the Gulf states, and the companies working together, which Renu hinted at. So I think for me, it's not about where you're lagging, but it's the question of how do you collaborate, coordinate, and implement the kind of engagement in terms of what's coming out where Africa's needs are. But again, the challenge here, Africa needs to basically put together the projects. The other example I'll give you is Rwanda, and how Rwanda, as a landlocked country, actually has now decided it works with the EU, it works with different actors in terms of building its capacity in terms of where it wants to be. So I think the challenges are much more in terms of what the bottlenecks and the institutional choke points are in Africa, but how you're going to work that going through. The other more critical issue, I think, is the question that we have to ask ourselves is, and I like the point Renu made about the young savvy generation that love EVs and all kinds of gadgetry and understand this electric vehicle and the gadgetry world that they're in. But how much of this is going to be production at source? In other words, we're not going to extract the critical minerals to take it out of the continent and then reconfigure them, purpose them, and then sell it back to the continent. And I think some countries in Africa may not be doing this, or some leaders in Africa are not doing this on the basis to say that we want production at source. They're using it also as a political tool in terms of their engagement. I mean, the Zimbabwean government not so long ago said, if you want our critical minerals, whether it's lithium, whether it's cobalt, whether it's whatever that's going to be powering up the EVs, then you can't take it out of, you can't extract. You've got to basically do the production at source. Do we have capacity at that? I think those are comparative advantages that will be interesting for a country like India with its capacity and its technical innovations that can come back into the continent with building those kinds of spaces, which younger people will then see in terms of the skills development and the colleges in terms of what Renu had mentioned under development cooperation, capacity building and training.
Thank you, Sanusha. I think it's a good way to finish this conversation. So we'll continue probably on another format. So I will contact you, the three of us, for interviews and to deepen certain topic we could not dig in today. We were very pleased. So I think we learned a lot from you. I hope the public is satisfied as well. And I thank you again for being with us, discussing. I think now it's time to eat in India. I wish you as well, so for the next week, an happy Diwali. And I hope we'll see very soon again. Thank you so much.
Happy Diwali to you too.
Happy Diwali to you.
Happy Diwali. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Please, you're welcome. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.